And you're looking at history and current events and you're trying to figure out how can we actually make this situation better for humanity and other species and you know, the environment. And what you may occasionally hear from folks that have a good head on their shoulders is this idea of decentralizing power and control and how that would actually make things better. So, first of all, that idea isn't voiced as much as it should be. And even when it is voiced, I find that the reason why it's so important isn't usually expressed clearly. Like, it's just given as like, this would probably, work out better rather than this is absolutely what we need to do. And it's for these very concrete and actually eternal reasons. Like, doesn't matter what time or place you're speaking about, the answer of decentralization actually has an ethical core to it that is applicable to all places and all times. So you can come at this understanding from two different sides. You can recognize it by seeing that when things and people are run in a decentralized or independent manner, oftentimes they're going to be offering the highest quality of product and experience. Just overall, qualitatively speaking, it's better. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you find things that are under the control of some central authority, usually unknown, as far as who exactly they are, and coming from a distant place, sending the orders down the chain of command. When you have that going on, oftentimes you can notice that the quality is worse, right? Your experience is worse. It's more frustrating to deal with. It makes less sense. So let me give some examples in case this isn't already ringing a bell of, familiarity with you. So let's take medical mandates, right? That just pretty much popped on the scene here in the so-called free world, in 2020, where local healthcare clinics and such were having to carry out these mandates that were given to them as an order coming down the chain of a command, right? Because they weren't actually independent. They were under the control of, right? They were subordinate to basically, in this scenario, the state, right? Whatever the state government and federal government above them was issuing as the new rule or policy or law, it filtered all the way down, or it traveled all the way down to the local level, to your healthcare clinic, where they're now telling you, you have to wear a medical device indefinitely, even though you're showing no signs of sickness, and and also if you want to travel and do other things, have a job, for example, you may need to get yourself injected with whatever the people at the top of the pyramid say you need to have injected into your body, right? So, huge example of medical mandates being a form of tyranny, right? Which is also a form of centralized power, right? It's because localities aren't independent that these mandates have any effect whatsoever, right? Otherwise, it would just be some guy in a far off land, shouting, "Oh, you need to inject this in your body and in the bodies of your children," and everyone looking at him like, "Yeah, okay, buddy," and just going on with their day, you know. It's only because it's this system of control that is pyramidal in structure, right? As the chain of command goes up, it gets to fewer and fewer people that they're subject to that authoritarianism. But it's not, I mean, you can notice this in many ways, right? From the gross to subtle level, right? So I would call medical mandates the gross level, but even on a much more subtle level, like I just tried to make an appointment and they told me, oh, we would normally take new patients, but because we're under the control of this greater medical group, and they issued the order that everyone has to have a pause on new patients. We have to wait until they lift the pause, and we have no idea when they're going to do that. But we can put you on a wait list. So that's just another example of like people having their hands tied, so to speak. They can't even carry out basic services in their community because they're part of a centralized power, right? They are not decentralized. They're not actually independent. It's not like, oh, this is just this woman or man who is a specialist in this medical field and offering their services to the community, and you can give them a call, make an appointment. No, it's you can call them, but they need to abide by the centralized rules, right? The centralized command that they've been, basically coerced to be a part of. And the theme over and over is a lessening of the quality of life. And as I said at the beginning, and I'll explain further, that's because of an actual deeper ethical issue at hand here. And that directly correlates to, is directly linked to the lack of quality. It's not coincidental that as you have a more centralized power structure, more authoritarianism, it tends to make living in society worse. Like, that's not coincidental. So other examples can be like mandates concerning appliances and utilities. So you may, depending on your age, remember when crosswalks in cities didn't make beeping sounds 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, right? Maybe you still don't live in a city that does that, but it's become increasingly the norm. And when I inquired about that, they said, well, yeah, we don't think it's so great either. Obviously, handicapped folks have been able to cross streets just fine without a 24-hour beeping sound, filling the neighborhood. But it's the new industry standard, right? So it'll go under the names of things like new industry standard or, new policy or rule. But it's just authoritarian control from the people at the top of the pyramid. And it comes down through these various industries and fields that you encounter, in your daily life. Another one would be lights, and this falls under the whole like green, quote, greening of society, which is being used as a front for gaining more control. So your options on like what kinds of lights you can buy have been reduced dramatically, right? And oftentimes the lights that they say are like the greenest ones and the ones we all have to buy now aren't actually better. For example, the compact fluorescent lights that they pushed on everyone and said, you have to use, contain mercury, right? So when those broke, and oftentimes children do break light bulbs, right? Of course, mercury is toxic towards everyone, child or adult, but especially toxic towards children, right? How many children got exposed to this poison because of the new green compact fluorescent lights that were mandated by the people at the top of the pyramid? And then also with like headlights on vehicles, depending on your age, you may remember when driving at night wasn't as horrible as it is now, right? Because of these super bright headlights that are ridiculously bright. They're like, sports stadium light bright. And, driving at night is just oftentimes just actually very dangerous because you're blinded repeatedly by the headlights of other vehicles that are just ridiculously bright and don't need to be so at all. Also, them turning on automatically, so you have folks driving with their lights on, when there's enough light from the day, from the sunlight itself or, from street lamps, etc. But you still got these blinding bright lights, causing disturbance left and right. So the theme is lowering the quality of life, spread throughout the whole world. It's actually making the world, and you may think this is, an extreme statement, but it's actually accurate to say it's making the world more hellish, right? Because as we have more and more light pollution, more and more noise pollution, of course, more and more toxins, even, through these devices and products that they say are less toxic, but just oftentimes is completely false, as I was just explaining. The centralized control, what the theme is just making the world worse and worse. It's just they get more and more control, and then society gets to be basically a shittier and shittier place to live in. Another example would be, centralized control with schooling, right? Where if you want to homeschool your kids, right, some places are making that out to be criminal in and of itself. And then when you do enter the state school system, just the level of absurdity that you're going to encounter is extremely well documented. Like, it's not a radical thing or a non-mainstream thing to say even nowadays that state education, state schooling has problems, right? Like, pretty much everyone agrees with that across the board. But the problems are not minor, and the effect that they have on the minds of children is not minor. And now that they're interconnecting their areas of control, you actually have like medical mandates entering the schools, where whether it's prescription drugs for supposedly whatever disorder they labeled the child with, but now also sex hormone therapy, which governors, I know for sure, I just read an article, governor of Maine just approved, are saying the parents' permission is no longer required. The schools could administer these chemicals and drugs to the children without the parents' permission, right? So I think that qualifies as more hellish. Having your children being drugged without your permission, and having their gender distorted, and having their minds confused with this gender dysphoria. And then on top of that, there's just the problem of state schooling as far as like what they actually teach, of course. But they don't teach you the real history, They're not going to tell you what really happened, say, in the United States with like the Civil War. They're just going to give you this whitewashed version of it, that it had nothing to do with folks wanting to be independent. It was just all about fighting slavery, right? That's like a huge example. But of course, that's just a common theme throughout history. They say, the victors write the history books, right? Whoever wins the war writes the history of the war. And of course, they write it in a way that puts them in a good light and puts their enemy, in a completely bad light. Just to circle back on the smart meters, I believe I mentioned, right, which are these Wi-Fi, wireless technology, electric meters. In the past, they would be analog, and someone from the electric company would come by and like read it off of the meter, which I didn't like the aspect of them just thinking they could walk onto your property, anytime willy-nilly. Like you look out bedroom window one day, and there's a guy with a clipboard standing out there. Um, but that, leaving that aside, even worse is actually these smart meters, because of the amount of radiation they emit. If you look into like the amount of radiation they emit, it's quite dangerous. And if you have that right on the other side of your bedroom wall, you know, you're going to be exposed to high levels of radiation, you know, for all those hours you're asleep there, along with, the lesser exposure throughout your day, whenever you're in the home. Also, they're used as a surveillance device, right? They track, everything you're doing concerning electricity in your home. Um, and then on top of that, they're hackable, so you can have if you use electric heaters, there's the potential that someone could hack your smart meter and turn off your electricity and heat, in the dead of winter. Scenarios like that are definitely possible. And likewise with vehicles. So that's another, as far as the drivetrain goes, as far as the engine goes. I talked about the lighting, but now they're pushing, the end of all internal combustion engines and everyone having electric vehicles. And if you just buy the surface level propaganda, you might think, oh, that sounds good, we can just. And I remember when I was younger, I thought it sounded like a good idea too. I was like, oh, well, you could just get some solar panels on your roof and a small wind turbine, and then you could just plug your car or truck right into your own, batteries that you got in the garage. And I was thinking it would actually be like pro independence. But it's not actually looking like it's going to be anything like that, because one of the key aspects or features of these electric vehicles is that, like the smart meters, they're hackable or remotely accessible. So your car can be turned off remotely and possibly even driven remotely, which of course is extremely dangerous. Not only because someone had like nefarious intent, but it could be along the lines of, oh, well, there was a mistake on your tax form or something like that, or you committed a hate speech violation, um, based on our new rules, you're lost your privilege to drive, right? And they can just remotely disable your vehicle, so you can no longer drive around independently, right? And this is why you never hear about like what would actually be something truly, green and also in line with freedom, which would be locally produced ethanol fuel, having what they call E100 engines, which they have going in Brazil. Here in the States, E85, which means 85% ethanol. But they can be made 100%. They are made 100%, like I said, in Brazil and elsewhere. And ethanol is just alcohol, so it's easy to produce alcohol. And then you're not dependent, not only are you not dependent on the electric grid and whoever is in control of the electric grid or whoever hacks into it, but you're not dependent on foreign oil either, right? If there's some embargo again or whatever, or of course the petroleum is running out, right? It's not an infinite supply beneath the Earth's crust, right? But alcohol can always be made. You can make alcohol from fruit scraps and all kinds of plant matter. It's relatively simple. It's something individual homesteaders and local farms and can do readily and easily. And if everyone had these E100 engines that weren't connected to some Wi-Fi grid, didn't have some microchip with artificial intelligence connected, talking to you about your social credit score, just to go off on a little imaginary tangent there, that would be much better, right? That would be qualitatively a higher standard of living. So when you observe all this, you should see the pattern, right? The pattern is as you lose independence, right? Individual independence, individual autonomy, and your local community loses independence and becomes, just the bottom level of a pyramid, which it is a pyramid again. So I think some people like roll their eyes like, oh, he thinks, everything's a pyramid or whatever. It's like technically accurate illustration, right? Again, the shape of a pyramid, it it perfectly coincides with what the actual societal structure is. You have large amount of people at the bottom, right? And then as you go up, it gets to less and less people, and the people at the top give the commands going from the top down, right? There's a chain of command. Like that's actually what society is like if you're part of the system, right? Unless you're completely independent, you're part of that chain of command, right? You're having to take commands from someone so above you, so to speak, right? You're not actually free from these rulers at the top of the pyramid, right? These unseen rulers, sometimes just simply called the ruling class, right? So the pattern remains that way in all of these seemingly unconnected, experiences in life, all these seemingly unconnected frustrations in life, right? That add more disturbance to our lives, like the noise pollution and the light pollution and the restrictions on, what vehicles we can drive and what medicine we can take and what we can't take and what they're telling us we have to take, and with schooling and on and on. It's all a result of an abusive relationship, which is what centralization of power is. When you deny someone their independence, their ability to make their own decisions, that's abuse of control, right? For a parent to, regulate the decisions of their child makes sense, right? Because a child is, as long as they're doing it non-abusively, right? That's not abuse of control because they're raising their child and they're protecting their child. But when you're an adult and you have other adults regulating your life in these ways, it's in no way equivalent to parental care. It's now abuse of control, and it makes your life and society worse. And so the solution is very simple. The opposite of centralization is decentralization. And oftentimes people don't take that far enough, right? They'll just say, oh, we need to like support our local city council or something like that. But that city council is just part of the pyramid again. And so you're going to be constantly fighting against the chain of command, which is ultimately in control of that little local council or whatever it is, or school board, or when you try to regain control of a lower level of the pyramid, ignoring the fact that it's still part of the pyramid, it's just an exercise in futility, as you can observe, as you may have experienced through your own efforts that basically didn't amount to much of anything, not due to your lack of intelligence or energy, but just because you're trying to gain control of something, that you're trying to make something independent. It's like trying to pull, a block out of the pyramid and set it off to the side, right? It doesn't work like that. You need to, well, I suppose that that might actually be a good illustration. Like you do want to actually remove the block and, pull it out and set it off to the side, kind of like that Jenga board game, or not board game, but you know what I mean, little uh, game using wood pieces where you pull out pieces and try to, in the game you're trying to not have the tower collapse, but in the context of decentralization, you actually do want that to happen. You want enough pieces to be pulled out that the whole thing just falls, because it no longer has these willing participants. And so the problem is people continue to participate in these institutions, right? Not really acknowledging that it is part of the pyramid in the first place, right? It's like if you're going to a university, you might think, oh, it's just this independent universe. No, it's not, right? Like recognize the chain of command. Or if you work for a small company that's owned by a larger company, well, then recognize that, right? Like so that they're going to be having to take commands from the administrators and the board members above them, right? So it's not like this is very complicated. If you're entering into an organization or business or what have you, that is part of a chain of command, right? And the level that you're entering in isn't the top, well, then you're going to be subject to some level of authoritarianism, some level of centralized control, right? And no, that isn't necessary. Like you don't actually, these institutions of power that are all interconnected and basically run by the same few rulers at the top, you don't actually have to participate. Like they didn't always, these institutions didn't always exist. There wasn't always, a Department of Education and, institution of healthcare and, all of these industry regulators and so on. Like it isn't necessary for them to exist and for us to be, sucked into their vampire system to kind of flip the symbolism there. So if you take decentralization all the way to its logical conclusion, there isn't like an infinite variety of possibilities. It leads to something very concrete, very simple. And it has to do with the fact that we're humans on the planet Earth. And it has to do with the fact that we need food, water, shelter, and space in order to have some freedom and independence and, health and security. And so that means everyone should have a little bit of land for their sovereign home, enough water to drink and for their crops, and enough space so they have privacy and independence, not part of some control grid, so that they can be treated as an individual worthy of basic respect, not being abused, right? If you landed on a deserted island with a bunch of other people, right, the same thing to do would be make sure, let everyone have their own space for, privacy and independence, and make sure everyone has access to basic natural resources that they need to survive. And then you can build society from that right foundation, right? But the way it is now is society is upside down. It's built on centralized abusive control and trying to then manifest social justice from this arrangement, which is impossible because it's fundamentally unethical. It's fundamentally unjust. So sovereign homesteading land and water and seed for everyone, that is the basic decency. That is the ultimate decentralization that would eliminate all of these disturbances and all of this abusive control. Then people can form communities voluntarily, folks that are healthcare specialists, educators, and so on and so forth, engineers, they can all offer their services to the community without being under some centralized command and without pushing their products on the community, right? It all being voluntary. The one providing the service isn't being coerced, and the one receiving the service isn't being coerced either, right? This isn't rocket science. It's just not being abusive. But because we're born into a world that is comprehensively abusive and unjust, and it's normalized, people don't realize how backwards everything is. And on top of that, they don't realize how much they're being programmed to accept things the way they are and to be out of order with nature on multiple levels, whether that's, lifestyle wise, but also psychologically, right? Influencing women to abandon femininity and become this like pseudo masculine, fourth wave feminist, combative, insufferable person. And then likewise with men, conditioning them to be pseudo feminine and abandon their masculinity and become these like emotional, well, trying to keep my language PG here, but just also basically a hot mess that is insufferable as well, right? And why do they program folks in that way? Just as a side note here, it's because it causes disharmony. And why would the rulers at top want to cause disharmony, especially between men and women? It's to break up family units. It's to cause that disorder among individuals and communities so that they can then come in as the supposed caretakers and, ones to fix the problem that they actually created. And they actually have this as their own motto: order out of chaos, right? People don't understand what that means. Is they create the chaos so that they can then impose their so-called order, which, their so-called solution. This is also known as the Hegelian dialectic, right? So they create the problem and then offer their fake solution, which is just what serves them the best. So I hope you found some of this insightful and that you will see that it's not a gray area. It really is black and white. We need complete decentralization, period, because that's the only ethical and sane way to end this increasingly disturbing and abusive societal arrangement. All right, thanks for listening. Another huge example of centralized control that's interlocking with these others, along with medical mandates and these industry mandates and education mandates, is the currency mandate, right? There's a lot of talk about our cash money being replaced with digital currency, right? And of course, that digital currency would be controlled through folks at the top of the pyramid, right? So it would be an immense loss of freedom, very similarly to having your electricity in your home and having your vehicles accessible and controllable by other people that happen to be abusive control freaks, right? So if they're able to get rid of cash and have all of your transactions be tracked and monitored and, recorded and logged, and additionally have your, whatever your currency ID number, or however it works, your microchip or whatever it is, have that be, remotely disabled for whatever arbitrary or just, straight tyrannical reason. That's another piece of this dystopia that's forming, and it's, again, very simply a dystopia of centralized power. Like, that's what makes it dystopian, rather than having currency that's local and, not part of a pyramidal structure of control. It's the complete opposite. It'll be no longer independent, no longer free, and be under the control. So the pattern is very clear. And I know other folks, like I said, have talked about decentralization, but they don't see, again, how black and white it is. If whatever you're talking about, whatever aspect of society, if it's part of a pyramidal structure of control, it's not going to be good for the society. It's only good for the rulers at the top of that pyramid. So the answer is to completely disconnect from that structure and to actually have real individual and local independence, and, like I said, have voluntary relations form on that sound foundation, rather than, living in this techno dystopia where, everything is under surveillance, everything is under centralized control, your vehicles, your currency, the products you use, and having to face all kinds of disturbances just out on the street, in the workplace, at school, wherever you are, all because you're constantly being bombarded by, absurdities and abuses from those at the top of the pyramid. Again, there is a solution: complete decentralization, which again is recognizing individual sovereignty, recognizing that we should all have a birthright to sovereign homesteading, land, water, and seed, and that homesteading should be non-abusive towards animals as well, and non-abusive towards the environment and other people. So it should be organic and vegan. So a veganic homestead, couple acres approximately per household. That would be a real social justice solution. That is the real social justice solution, because it's completely decentralized, the opposite of the abusive centralization that just makes life as unpleasant as it is, and increasingly so as these centralized measures are rolled out more and more.